Welcome to our audience members joining. We'll be starting in just under 2 minutes as we allow people to join the webinar. Thank you. Welcome to all our audience members joining. We'll be getting started in around 1 minute. We're just allowing people to join the webinar. Thank you. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know a very early morning for some of you joining, so thank you for being here for the launch of the Practice Standards and 10-Year Review on what is the final day, unfortunately, of the Red Lac Cafe Virtual Congress. And I know it's been a fantastic week of sessions so far. My name is James Ellsmore from Island Innovation, and I'm just here to give you a few technical pointers before we get started. So for those of you who have already attended sessions, there shouldn't be anything new, and I can already see some of you actively, proactively messaging in the chat to say hello. Please do make sure that when you send a message in the chat, you click the blue box just above the screen and select panelists and attendees to make sure everyone sees your message. And for those of you already here, please do drop a quick message in the chat to introduce yourself, and so everyone else and our speakers know who is here. You'll note that we also have a Q&A, so if you do have questions at any point, those will be sent in separately to the chat. And so just a reminder there, please do make sure you send them into the Q&A. There will be time for questions after our panel discussion. As an attendee, you can also comment on and upvote questions that are particularly interesting to you, so make sure you do also use those features. Just a reminder that this session will be recorded and live streamed onto Facebook, so you'll be able to access it immediately after the session. And in fact, all the sessions for the week will be accessed immediately on Facebook, and they'll also be uploaded next week onto YouTube, and those links will be sent out to you also in case you missed any sessions this week. And finally, we'd like to say a big thank you to our team of interpreters who have been working since the very early hours of this morning already. And if you would like to listen in French or Spanish, you can simply click the interpretation button and choose the language that you would like to hear the session in. And so with that, I'll hand over to Zdenka Piskulich, the president of Red Lac. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third and final day of the Red Lac Cafe Virtual Congress. Today is a very special day because today is also the culmination of great efforts in conjunction with the Conservation Finance Alliance and CAFE and other networks to launch the practice standards and the 10-year review of the conservation trust funds. And therefore, I would like to welcome Katie Mathias, who is joining us and who will be moderating this part of the event. Katie is the Conservation Finance Project Manager for Wildlife Conservation Society. She is also the co-author of the Annual Conservation Trust Investment Survey, CTIS, which is a study of the investment management practices of conservation trust funds, project manager of the educational programs related to CTIS, and also serves as a consultant to conservation trust funds on governance, resource mobilization, organizational effectiveness, and risk management. So she knows a lot about conservation trust funds, and it's really an honor, Katie, to have you here and to have you moderate this important panel, which I'm sure will be extremely useful for all of those who are participating in this event. So with that, I leave it to you, Katie. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Zdenka, so much. And it is so great to be here amongst everyone. I wish we could see everyone in person, but it's great to be able to see everyone even just virtually. So thank you and welcome thank you for joining us today. I am really excited for this session because I think it's going to be a great sharing of both work that's been happening over the last just over a year, the culmination of a project that's been going on for really over 2 years as we first came together to talk about how to do the update of the practice standards and to do the 10-year review of CTFs as well, and a great sharing of knowledge and experience from our panelists today. So let me take a moment to thank the donors who have made this project possible. Without them, we truly would not have been able to do this work. MAVA Foundation, FM, the Trillion Trees Project, which is a collaboration among BirdLife, WWF UK, and the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Jeff Secretariat, WWF US, MG Capital, and Costa Rica Por Siempre, all contributed financially to make this project a possibility, and we have huge thanks to them. I also want to thank a group of very dedicated volunteers from the Conservation Finance Alliance who contributed their time as task force members to review the content, to provide input and ideas, to support the Secretariat and the consulting team who were working on this. Their input is deeply valued, and their time commitment as well. The names of the task force members are up on the screen. I'd also specifically like to thank the Environmental Funds Working Group, which is chaired by Zdenka and by Robbie Vivino, who were the sponsoring organization to this project and whose members provided feedback and review of the content, and to the CTS Advisory Committee, who specifically worked on the asset management standards. REDLAC and CAFE are critical partners to this effort and have been since the very beginning, and we would not have gotten this work done without them either. So thank you to all the CAFE and REDLAC members who participated in interviews and in survey completion and in providing feedback. So a quick overview of our agenda for today. We'll have some remarks from a donor to this initiative to talk about why we've taken on this work. Highlights from the 2020 update to the practice standards. Then we'll officially launch the 2020 standards. We'll have a panel discussion with some Conservation Trust Fund leaders and talking about how they have been using the standards since they were first launched in 2014. Then we'll have a preview of the forthcoming 10-year review of CTFs and a discussion about the future of CTFs and where CTFs are going in the next decade. So let me introduce our first speaker. Constance Corbière is the Biodiversity Program Officer at the French Facility for Global Environment, FM. FM and Constance have been enormous champions of networks and of knowledge sharing and capacity building among CTFs for years, and we're very grateful for her willingness to join us this morning and to share some thoughts on the importance of practice standards. So Constance, I will hand it over to you.
Sorry, can you hear me? It's okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, hello everybody, good afternoon, because in Paris it's 3 o'clock. Very happy to be here with you. And when I look at the task force that Katie put on the screen, I was just thinking it was really the dream team of the CTF and the CTF network and brain. It's the brain of the CTF there. So I'm very proud and very honored to be invited to this group. And well, I will be very short because first I have talked already yesterday, so I don't want to bore the audience. But I wanted to stress that for many years, FFM has been supported creation and development of trust funds, mainly in Africa, Madagascar, Mauritania, Guinea-Bissau, but also in Caribbean countries such as Marfund with Mexico, Belize, Honduras, and Guatemala. So we are usual suspects, but old ones working together with trust funds. And we are on the verge of launching 2 new very challenging projects, one with the CBF, the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, and the other one with Pacifico, with the Panama, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Ecuador on marine resources and coastal resources. So I don't want to vendre la peau de l'ours avant de l'avoir tué, as we say in French, but we are very happy if this development of our action to support CTF and regional platform could happen next year. Well, I have to quote MAVA as our most closer partner in those actions of supporting not only CTF, but networking between CTFs and platform of actors. And as a matter of fact, MAVA is supporting, like, together with FFM, the CFE, and also was a supporter together with the FFM of the last Project Cape between Red Lac and CAFE. So I dare speak in its name because it's also thanks to MAVA that we are happy to launch this new publication. Well, FFM wants to acknowledge the tremendous progress made to ensure that CTFs are synonymous with good management, transparency, and maximize positive impact. Thanks to these efforts, a shared knowledge on the main feature of CTF has emerged across the world and is showcased in these expanded practice standards for Conservation Trust Fund. Now, it is reasonable to hope that in the near future, an increased number of CTFs will gain additional strength and will earn the trust of all actors, public, private, and civil society, including academic and science, showing the case that CTF that people can rely on CTF for sustainable environmental and social impact on the ground, while ensuring increased financial resource for conservation. FFM take this opportunity to congratulate all the stakeholders who have played a role in the development of these institutions and networks. FFM invites CTF to follow the PTFs, all the CTFs, to follow the proposed practice standards and to implement an ever increasing number of ambitious initiatives to make a difference on the field. The theoretical basis of the CTFs is now well established, and the way is now paved to multiply a positive environmental impact at all scales. This is certainly a significant step for a better environmental future, and we are very happy to celebrate these new practice standards with the stress, and I will close my speech with that. We are very keen as donors to stress the environmental and social impact and measure on the ground. So we are very happy with what is the content of practice standards in this view. Thank you very much.
Constance, thank you. And thank you to you and to FM and to MAVA for the support that you have given to CTFs and to this project specifically. We appreciate you being here today. Thank you. I am not sure actually that our next speaker needs introduction, but I will introduce him anyway. Lorenzo Rosenzweig is well known to the Conservation Trust Fund community from his leadership of Fondomeccano for many years, his role in as the director, as a member of the board of directors of Marfund, and as member of the executive committee of Red Lac and of CAFE. Lorenzo was a key player in the Conservation Trust Fund projects task force in helping to get this initiative off the ground. and he has agreed to share the update of what is new in the forthcoming 2020 practice standards. So Lorenzo, I will turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kathy. I cannot start my video because the host has stopped it. So can you please activate it so I can begin? Kathy, you hear me?
I do hear you. I'm not sure that I have
okay, now
the ability
I can
to do
start.
that. I think, yes, perfect.
Can you see me? Yeah, you can see me.
Yes.
Morning to everybody. I can't believe it's almost a year since we met last time all together as a big family in Mérida on the 21st Assembly of REDLAC. Time really passes, and I am amazed that then, on the other hand, more than 20 years have passed since the day we decided to put together this learning network, which is REDLAC, which has proved an amazing tool for many conservation trust funds around the world. So thank you, Kathy. And I'll make just a very brief review if you want to put the slides, please, that we prepared. Let me give you a little bit of history. The original moment when we decided to launch an updating of the practice standards that we had prepared back in 2014 was in 2017 in REDLAC's assembly in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. That's when we met together, CFA, REDLAC, and CAFE, and we discussed it was about time to update them, to improve them, make them more useful to everybody. And that's where we set a fundraising campaign for them and decided to put together a small task force to follow up. It was later in 2019 that we decided to merge the new edition or the new improved version of the practice standards with the 10-year review of conservation trust funds, which was a very fortunate decision. Also, we decided to fuse both committees with one follow-up committee. And we did a call for proposals in 2019. Luckily, we had extremely good proposals. It was a very difficult choice among them, but in the end, we chose Wolf's Company and Aligning Vision, two institutions, two consulting groups that had large experience and also have lots of interaction with this constituency. So it was very fortunate to be able to work with them. And in that process, we were able last October and November, as you remember, to have consultations and to have direct interviews on the subject during the Mérida and the 21st Assembly. So it was a very fortunate process that we took on. Luckily, we were able to secure the funding. We are still in the process of securing a smaller amount of funding for the final editing and distribution, but basically all of the funding is in. And we are very proud of being able to contribute with this, through these three networks, to something useful for environmental funds. The project goals of this 2020 version of the practice standards is to really understand how much conservation trust funds have been using them, how useful they have been. That was part of the consultations, and that knowledge was put into this version. We also decided early on that there were several standards that we had to include. The world is moving really fast, and we decided we had to incorporate new standards on risk management, and safeguards, on communication, on human resources, human capital, and on technology. We did minimum edits to the existing standards, the one that we were based on. because they were a great work. And Katie and the group asked me to make a note here that building on the past of what has been done is a great opportunity to go further in quality, in depth, and content. So basically, we are building on the previous work of the original standards, and we are very proud that by building on what was being done, we can have a much better product. Can I have the next slide, Katie? The new core, we added a new core area, which is an area that we consider critical, which is risk management and safeguards. And we did a regrouping, which makes this version of the practice standards a much more friendly tool for to work. The regrouping calls for two new core areas, which are institutional effectiveness and programs. Programs assimilates the previous operations core area. And we did a very, we supported a very innovative approach of the consultants to have cross-cutting themes, which are communications, human resources, monitoring and evaluation, and technology into the standards. We have also, we included also, excuse me, we included also a new asset management standard that allows conservation trust funds to align investment of their endowments with policy and with the policy and with the mission. And we also added at the end sample assessment tools that allows the conservation trust funds, as they grow, as they improve, as they evolve into more mature institutions, to be able to assess themselves. So this makes it a much more powerful instrument. I am very happy to see it almost released, and we will see more on that later. And I want to have a few additional comments on this amazing tool. One is that many conservation trust funds, among them the Conservation Trust Fund of Mexico, we are adapting these standards to improve the institutional capacity of civil society organizations of recipients in country. We are also adapting them to a new modality that we are putting together in Mexico, which is called National Regional Conservation Funds. In large countries, regional conservation funds make a lot of sense in making its own, helping have a more on-site knowledge for conservation. And so that's an added value of this kind of tools that can be adapted and sort of be tailor-made to smaller or to more regional or local institutions. We know that conservation trust funds face a serious increase or an important increase in complexity in the day-to-day work they do. But that complexity, which is natural because the world is getting more complex, that complexity has not evolved into complicatedness, which is a very interesting term, because some institutions react to complexity in ways that make things even more complicated. So I think these practice standards allow the institutions very much to keep an eye on complexity, keep it tamed, and be able to put in creativity, innovation, and of course, more conservation finance. Also, as you know, the conservation tools, the conservation, the practice standards are a very good tool for many donors to reduce or to flatten the due diligence curve when they are meeting new recipients. Finally, I just want to make a remark on this great family of conservation trust funds, that we are close to 100 institutions worldwide, Latin America, Africa, and Asia Pacific, and we're getting close to managing $2 billion together, so in endowment and project funds. So that makes environmental funds an amazing tool to advance conservation, to bring in new paradigms for development. And I cannot say how much happy I am with these results, and I think everybody should be credited with this great effort. Thank you very much, and hope we can see each other soon in the traditional way. Good luck to everybody.
Lorenzo, thank you very much for those, for sharing what we've been doing and for sharing how the standards have been of value over those years. Let me now introduce the Executive Director of Conservation Finance Alliance, David Myers. David will now introduce the official launch of the 2020 standards.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Lorenzo. We are very, very excited to launch these standards, and for the launch ceremony, I'm going to ask sort of all the participants on this webinar and our partners that are standing by here just to turn on your video, and I'm going to ask everyone at home to move to gallery mode if you can. So up on the above where you see the pictures, it says show grid video. I think that's the or gallery mode if you've got the. Maybe Katie, you could take off the screenshot for a second, or the organizers could do that. We can get everyone's faces out here. Yeah, so if everyone's seeing one big picture, then go to the top right and click gallery view, and you can see all the people who, there's so many people who played such a role in getting this to become a reality. We're so proud of the results, and we are so thankful for, first off, Kathy McKeaton and Barry Spergel, who produced the first version of this. This version's been used enormously for trust funds across the world, not just creating new trust funds, but obviously even improving trust funds. And we'll hear from some trust funds in the panel about that. We again, thanks to Katie, already thanked the donors, but I just want to reiterate that thanks. What we're going to do for this launch is we're going to switch to a screenshot of the report. The report is unfortunately not perfectly ready for release, but for you all watching right now, we've got a special opportunity where we've posted it online, which it'll be available for the duration of this webinar, and then we're going to take it off. So if you'd like to download it, we're going to put that up on the screen in a sec. And so again, here you can, if you well, we're going to paste the link into the chat box, so you'll be able to click on that link from the chat box. But here it is. This is the 2020 practice standards. An updated version, thanks to all of the great writers, Paquita, Viviana, and Almacar, and thanks to Wolf's Company and Lining Visions for getting it produced and done, and thanks to everyone for doing it. And maybe we'll just go back to the pictures of everyone here, and we'll do a round of applause for releasing the. You could probably take your microphone off for a second and just, yeah, congratulations everyone. And hopefully this will be as powerful as others.
Yay!
Right, nicely
Yay.
done. All right, so I believe that is released now. And again, this is a pre-publication release. It is not formatted. It's just the information, but that information is very useful. And we'll have the final published version in, I think, about a week or so. Is that right, Katie? All right. Well, looks like you can't unmute yourself, so no worries.
Sorry, I couldn't. Yes, that is correct. About a week.
Okay, great. Anyway, so please, thanks again to everyone for contributing. And please check your CFA newsletter. That's where we'll announce when the fully published version is going to be released. And we look forward to feedback from it. And to go into the practice standards a little bit, we'll move to the next panel. And so we can, I'll be moderating that panel. So I'm very pleased to let's see how well this transition goes. You could probably move back to the speaker view if you've got your if you're sitting at home with the panel view. Thanks everyone so much for joining for the release. And yeah, so very excited on this panel. We have Karen McDonald-Gale, who's the program manager for the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, and Serge Ratsirahonana. Sorry, Serge. And then when we get into the questions and answers, we're lucky to have Bakita Bath, who will join us to answer questions about the new practice standards if they come up. But we'd like to start off with Karen and just a 5-minute introduction about the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and perhaps how you've used the practice standards in the past. And then we'll pass over to Serge. I'll start with a few questions myself about your experiences and your funds, and then we will open it up for questions from the floor. So please start. As soon as the speakers start with their presentations, please feel free to jot down some questions that you might have in the Q&A, and then we will be able to ask the panelists. So over to you, Karen, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, David. Good morning to you. Good morning to everybody. Buenos dias, bom dia, bonjour. I wanted to take 1 minute to just talk about connections and to make sure and make the link for you on the value of REDLAC. For those of you who have been just joining for the last 2 days, if the last 2 days did not convince you, those of you who know me know that I've always sung the praises of REDLAC. I've been involved in REDLAC from my former life, another trust fund that I worked with till now, and it has been an amazing professional and indeed personal resource for me. So congratulations to REDLAC on continuing their work. And for CAFE joining in. And one of the personal connections that were made was with Camila Montero, who I want to recognize. A lot of the work that I'm about to present was done in collaboration and partnership with Camila as a consultant to the Caribbean Biodiversity Program Fund. So thank you, Camila, and big up, as we say in the Caribbean. Next slide.
Karen,
just very quick.
Oh,
yes.
Katie, sorry, it's Katie. Can you switch the screens because it's we've got the presenter view, I think, of the video. If I'm not right. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
David.
Sorry, Karen. Over to you.
Okay, that's all right. So just very quickly, Katie, next slide. The Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. There's a lot more online, but the quick version is that we were established in 2012 as a regional umbrella Caribbean Trust Fund. When I joined REDLAC, as you heard me mention just now, we were the only the fund that I was with at the time was the only English-speaking island fund. We had a couple other Caribbean partners, Guyana and Belize, I remember, and of course, Dominican Republic was there. And what we've done is move from there to create these national conservation trust funds through the Conservation Finance Program of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, which I am the program manager for. And the endowment fund serves as the instrument that has established the first formal links between these trust funds as a permanent source of funding for them to help with the creation of the funds through phases that we have come up with. We have worked with them through their, what we've called phase 1, their startup phase, their early operations and their consolidation. And since the early establishment of the CBF and the funds, we have used the practice standards throughout in terms of our operations. Next slide. So as you can see, since 2012, there's a much longer timeline, but we worked on the creation. There were 7 new funds created under the original CBF establishment. And as you can see, between 2014 and 2016, those new funds were created, and there was 1 existing fund that we worked with. And the next slide. And what we tried to do was incorporate all aspects of the practice standards. When we did our sustainability action plan that Camilla and I and the team from the Nature Conservancy worked on, the practice standards were the key to what we were making sure that the trust funds had reached in terms of reaching the stage of operationalization. And for those of you who know the CBF very well, you've seen this graph many times before. When we started in 2015, this is something that Yabanex Batista designed, and he sends his greetings to all. You can see that the standards that we use, or the milestones that we use, are very much connected to some of the practice standards that were established, that you're legally established, that you have a functional board, and that definition of a functional board came from the practice standards, that you have bylaws and constitutional documents, that you have an operation manual, and that you have staff. And next slide. And in the 5 years since we first came up with that graph, we are so happy that it is all now mainly green with the original funds that we worked with. And in particular, again, I recognize the trust funds that are here with me on the call, the National Conservation Trust Funds. Not only have they operationalized and begun giving grants, they're also now very much REDLAC members. So the Caribbean island contingent in REDLAC has grown considerably. And part of that is the acknowledgement and the recognition of the value of working with REDLAC. The trust funds, next slide, have also with us from the beginning worked on how the practice standards work for them. This is small, but I wanted to show you that over 3 years, we've been monitoring. We all know 2020 is crazy, and I'll get to it for 2020, but we've been monitoring the trust funds against the practice standards. And what we ask them to do is self-monitor, to answer questions that start to review how they've been working against the practice standards. And you can click again, Katie. And this is just to show you an average, of where we are and what we've tried to get from that information. As the practice standards have always said, it's not that we're going to have perfectly shaped polygons. The idea is that it will change as the trust funds have changed, but the practice standards have been the source of showing growth and development of our trust funds that we've had to establish over the time. And we have been grateful for the information that the standards have been able to produce. I'll also note that we, of course, in the Caribbean have worked in both English, French, and Spanish. Haiti will be our first French fund coming up soon, and so we're very pleased that there's also the versions of the practice standards in all languages. So again, the practice standards have been an enormous resource. It was a pleasure working with the team on upgrading, reviewing, seeing the applicability and assessing the applicability of the standards as we've gone through, and the idea of the dynamism of the funds of the practice standards is something that I was pleased to see, and that we had a chance to review and update it, and that the CBF application has been able to be useful in that process. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Karen, so much, and thank you for all the contributions to this new version. It's greatly appreciated. So we're going to move to Serge Ratsirahunana, who's the Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist at the Fondation des Aires Protégées et Biodiversité de Madagascar, the Foundation for Protected Areas and Biodiversity of Madagascar. And Serge, I believe you're going to show your own slides, so when you have a chance, you can share your screen. And over to you, Serge.
Hey, David. Hi. Thanks for introducing me. it's a great pleasure. It's great to be part of this panel. I would like to start my presentation with what the Foundation pour les aires protégées la biodiversité de Madagascar is. It has been created in 2005. The question is, have we used the standards at this time? I'm not sure about that. But when I look at the standards now, I'm pretty sure that we have been using the standard thanks to FFEM, to Conservation National, WWF, the government of Madagascar at this time. They have been very inspired to follow up, to create the FFPPN without knowing that the standard are, but they, in some way, they used the standard at this time in 2005. We start to support 6 PAs, protected areas with the KfW single fund, that's a Depth for Nature, in 2007. And in 2010, we add 2 more protected areas with endowment fund. That's the first time we used the interest from endowment fund in 2010. Now we have 36 protected areas supported by FFPPM with 5 PS supported by sinking fund and 30 of them with the endowment fund and 1 with the innovative financial mechanism offset from QMM, a mining company in Madagascar. That's very interesting because we only support 36 PAs out of the 120 something protected areas in Madagascar within the national network. It's very interesting to know that we are working to increase the number of the protected areas
I think we've lost Serge, if anyone is able to step in until he can rejoin.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was me. Serge, I think we've lost your connection, unfortunately. So we will maybe start to open it up for some questions already to Karen, and hopefully Serge will be able to rejoin. Just as a reminder, please put your Q&A questions into the Q&A box. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have Paquita Bath, one of the co-authors of the new practice standards, who will be able to answer some questions as well. So but let me start off with a question to Karen. Karen, so interesting to see how you've integrated the practice standards into your operations and support in a way for these other national funds. What do you think was the most sort of interesting or valuable element of being able to have those practice standards available to you as you're building your support for these national funds? And is there any sort of size, do the practice standards work for funds of small size as well as large size?
Thanks, David. I think, Serge is back. Let's see. I don't know what you mean. So I think in terms of the use of the practice standards and the value, it really comes in that term of standard, that across the board with the various trust funds that we were setting up, we could give them information on trust funds and how they should operate, very specific to conservation trust funds, and that's something that we were able to demonstrate. It also gave them a vision, because we were starting from scratch, from brand new. They could see where they were heading, and that was also useful. And the final thing I would say is, of course, with donors and fundraising, the fact that the trust funds were using these standards and could relate to these standards was definitely a plus for the new donor, the new funds reaching out to donors to be able to say that we are meeting and working with standards that have been assessed by the industry, our sector.
Okay, I think we're trying to get Serge back here, but I'm going to ask another question while James and Serge try to work that out. And in terms of, I've heard often that governments, one of the big issues with trust funds, as many of us know, is the relationship between, is it an independent fund, or is it a, what role does government play? And I'm just curious as to how the practice standards have played a role in that, in terms of, supporting independent funds and supporting, a separation from government, or clearly defining the role of government in national conservation trust funds.
I think that's been mixed between the value of the practice standards themselves, but also the network of those who also had other interactions with governments and how they operate. And I'll start there. We had very specific sessions in the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean. We have a colonial past. Our governments are strong. Let's use that word. And being able to balance that government interaction has been something that we have maneuvered and worked with very carefully. And we had experiences from our REDLAC partners that were useful in that respect. On the flip side, and Paquita, I'm sure, can say more, the standards are broad enough and written in such a way that it covers the description of partners, and specifically the role that we think that government should play. That there is a role for government, first of all, that acknowledgement and recognition, but also to make sure that it could work with a range of possible relationships with the government.
Great. Well, I just see that Katie has posted the link to the pre-publication version of the practice standards. If you're interested in getting a copy of those new standards now, you can just go to the chat area and click on that link. Again, that's only going to be open for the time of the webinar. And James, I guess when Serge is ready, we can maybe go back to his presentation. You'll have to just let us know.
Yeah, I was just going to interrupt there, David. I think
Okay.
Serge is back. I've asked him to turn off his camera, but Serge, if you want to go ahead and share your screen when you're ready, we'll have another go.
Great, and then we'll get back to Q&A after. Thanks.
Great, you can go ahead then, Serge.
Okay, I'm sorry for this, to be interrupted with the connection. So I said that in 2005, the FLPDM was created by WWF, Conservation International, and the government of Madagascar, but with the support of FFEM and more of our partners for conservation, biodiversity conservation in Madagascar. We started to support 6 PAs protected areas in 2005 with the KFW sinking fund, that's depth for nature. And in 2010, we had 2 more protected areas with the endowment fund. That's the first year we started to support with the endowment fund interest. The question is, have we used the standard at this time? I'm not quite sure, but when you look closely at the standards, I think that we have been very well supported by technical and our donors at this time to follow the standards. It was released in 2014, but we already previously used the standard. And in 2020, we support 36 protected areas, which is 5 of them from sinking fund, 30 from endowment fund, and 1 protected areas from a very innovative financial mechanism for us here in Madagascar. That was last year we started to use this financial mechanism to support protected areas in Madagascar. For FRBBM, we have a board with 9 members. Within it, we have 4 committees: a fundraising committee, a committee for enforcement, a committee for funding protected areas, and a committee for compliance or audits. At the executive direction, we have a new executive director has been hired last year, and we are 6 officers working for full-time for executive direction. We have a compliance officer, a finance officer, grant officer, M&E officer, which is me, administrative officer, and the marketing communication officer. We are less than 15 people working at the executive direction. It's a quite small team, but we are working full-time for the foundation. Here, I'm sorry, it's in French, but that the slide we use the most here in Madagascar to promote the foundation, to make it known by our partners at the national level. We have now 74.8 million euros, and we allocated last year $2 million for the 36 protected areas, and we have very positive performance for our investment, 12.7%. And we, as you can see on the right side of the slide, we are using a few indicators and indexes like the IB, KPI, and some indicators for communities, local development. So here is a diagram to show our donors, the part they brought into the capital of the foundation. So just end up my presentation with what are we making this year? We taking advantage of the COVID-19 lockdown to work on the policies and manual at for the foundation. We have updated the policy on capital investment this year. It's done in June 2020, and we want to update some policies on prioritization and funding protected areas, policies on social environmental safeguard, and we never use policies on complaint management or policy on gender or policy on ecological restoration or management of invasive plants, but we need to have them because last year when AFT came to the FRBBM, they want to bring more capital, more funds to our capital. They ask us a lot of questions about policies. And I guess that are going along with the new standards of what for conservation trust fund, and we are doing. It's going to take whatever it takes, but we are working with very qualified consultants to update our policies and to elaborate new policy on complaint management, on gender, and ecological restoration. But we're going to have them done by the end of this year. And this year, the KfW will come also to, they're going to ask the same question as the AFD did last year, and it's going to be about these policies and the manuals. We have manuals on administrative, financial, MND, monitoring and evaluation, and so on. And we're working on that just to be, to show that we are still reliable, we are still accountable, and we can be based on the solid, robust tools for management. That end up my presentation. I thank you. I'm very grateful to you to have me on this panel. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Serge.
As you say.
Thank you, Serge. Just a quick note from Melissa Moy, who was sort of there at the creation of the fund in Madagascar, and she was saying that the proposal for the standards was partly motivated by Madagascar's experience, since the donors of the fund did not have a common view of different aspects, and KfW, which is obviously a large donor to the Madagascar Fund, was one of the first to propose creating the standards because of the challenges and opportunities of establishing the fund in Madagascar. So the fund the standards did not exist back at the time of the Madagascar Fund's creation, but the Madagascar Protected Area and Biodiversity Fund was definitely involved in encouraging it. We have a question. So great, thanks everyone for your question. Thank you, Serge, for your presentation and for making it through the technical difficulties. And we do have a question regarding the new practice standards. This is for Paquita. This is from Renee Gonzalez. Do you have a chance to compare the standards with the requirements for accreditation with the Green Climate Funds? Pointing to those standards that are aligned would help those CTFs that are seeking accreditation, for example.
Thank you, Renee. We have seen a huge increase in the number of CTFs who are getting accredited, not just with Green Climate Fund, but obviously with the Adaptation Fund, with other funds, GEF, et cetera. So there's not a direct alignment between the standards and each of the different accreditation requirements. However, I will say that one of the major reasons for the upgrade and adding these new subject areas to the practice standards this year is precisely risk management policies and safeguards, which, as you know, is a key part of these accreditation standards. And I think those have been addressed in the new 2020 updates to the standards. Hope that helps.
Great, thanks, Paquita. There's a couple more questions. I think that some of them have been answered, but let's bring them up anyway here. From Scott Lampman, Karen, the impressive use of the practice standards by the CBF with the dashboard and the spider graphs, which are amazing. He didn't say that, I'm adding the amazing part. Makes reference to the old practice standards. Will the updated version of the practice standards allow the same utility? It may be a little too early to ask you, Karen, but and Paquita can certainly add in. But I'd
like to jump on that one. Karen and Camila's work on how they've applied the practice standards with the Caribbean Trust Funds has just been amazing. And so it is basically annexed to in the current practice standards. We've made very, very few changes. It was a really very, very useful practical tool for how to apply the practice standards at all levels of conservation trust funds. So again, many thanks to the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund for sharing that with us. And we have run with the good examples that we've been given. So this is a great example.
Karen, did you want to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, I was going to say one that the team had full access to that information. I think, as I noted to Scott, the hardest part will be making sure that we can show the continuum. So I did up to 2019, and as I said, we'll do 2020, but will it change? Can we then compare governance from 2017 with the new standards? And as I said, I think the team was actively making sure that that at least worked well as we move forward.
I'd like to add to that as well. One of the things that we've included is one of the annexes, two different annexes, which I think will be very helpful as well. One is a link between what the old standards were and the names of the new standards, so that when groups that have traditionally been evaluating their projects go forward, they can easily make that transition the first year. So we have that as one of the annexes. And the other annex that we've added, which is a little bit more difficult to 100% be clear about, but you know, the standards are substantial, and they're all useful, but some of them are more useful at different stages in the evolution of a conservation trust fund. And so we've also tried to clarify which standards are really critical during the startup phase versus standards that might require greater levels of sophistication for a trust fund that is much further along in its development. So that's an additional annex as well, to try really clarify when different standards might be the most useful for incorporating into your conservation trust fund's work.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. We've got a few more questions coming in here, and I'm not sure how much time we have left, but we'll move forward. This is let's see, sorry. So there's one question from Leslie Fernandez. Thank you for the presentation. Is there a periodic review plan for the practice standards?
The FAA. You get that one, David.
Well, it was really such a great experience this past year working with you all. I'm happy to review them regularly. I think, I mean, the last practice standards came out in 2014. This one version is 2020. I'm figuring that, you know, perhaps 6 years from now, they'll be ready for another review. I have to say that the original practice standards by McKeaton and Spergel really were, in a way, and that had contributions from sort of everyone involved across the donors and trust funds and networks, and, you know, just really laid a great groundwork and a great set of standards that are super useful. So we've been very fortunate to be able to just to tweak and add to that, and we've made a lot of effort to maintain the original wording and standards as much as possible. And Paquita, I just want to recognize your amazing respect for that past work and your wordmanship in getting the new standards upgraded and bringing these new ideas in a way that was that hopefully, for example, for Madagascar Fund and for Karen, they'll be as non-disruptive as possible. And yes, we will keep looking at them and keep improving them over the years, but probably not for the next 4 or 5 years. So, and let's see, any more questions here? Funds really reach those who live. Okay, this is a sort of a general question, but I think we can ask Serge this. This is from Javier Recalde. How do you make sure that the funds really reach those who live in the conservation areas? So how do you make sure that the funds coming from the FAPBM arrive at those communities that are adjacent to conservation areas or living right next to them? Serge, over to you.
Yes. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah.
we can.
We have manuals to fund, and we have monitoring manual as well to follow up. The fund effectively arrives at the site level. We conduct a mission to the site, and every year we sign a convention, annual convention. We review the convention at the grant agreement with the park manager every year, and we have a monitoring and evaluation system to follow up this fund. And every 3 months, they send us a report, financial report and technical report. We check out. We have a system to check out thoroughly for financial and technical activities they conduct at the site level. Hope I answer the question.
Great, thank you, Serge. Yeah, I think we're getting close to the end of the time here. Maybe if maybe everyone, Paquita, Karen, and Serge can just give a quick 30-second sort of final statement on what the practice standards mean to you and mean to the CTFs that you work with. Paquita, maybe over to you.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to just thank so much Wolf's Company and CFA and the CFA Task Force for working on this with us. It really became a big team effort looking at all of this. There are actually 19 new standards, so this is not a minor addition. There's a lot of new things there for people to consider and work through. I think that the annexes, as we've already pointed out, with the help of Karen and so many other CTFs that contributed ideas, really also add to it in terms of the practicality for its application. So very much open to working with people on helping to apply it and make it real. So thank you all.
Thanks, Paquita. Serge, maybe over to you for a last 30-second, 1-minute comment.
Yeah, Madagascar Biodiversity Fund now is one of the biggest foundations in Africa, but we still have, we still support only 36 protected areas in Madagascar. And we hope that we can use the standard to make us more reliable at the international level. And we can, just to make sure that we use the fund correctly at all levels we work on. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Serge. And Karen, a final statement.
Thanks, David. I think to quick comment on the size of funds and the relevance of the standards to the varying sizes of funds, that it was very useful that the micro funds, as I've been calling them, have found the standards useful in their startup and how they operate. And the other was to half answer some of the questions coming in on regional trust funds, etc. Is, of course, CBF is itself a conservation trust fund and have used the standards as well in how they have designed and operated in our own regards. And the questions that are generated as the list of grading yourself, and that's the wrong term because it's not grading, seeing where you are in any particular year, that come out with the practice standards are really useful in terms of self-assessing and seeing where the funds are and where you are in operating. So I think we hope those tools will continue as we go forward.
Great, thank you, Karen. Well, I just want to add one more super huge thanks to Katie Mathias, who has led this project at the Conservation Finance Alliance from its start through its finish. And Katie, you've really been steadfast and keeping us all in line. So I just wanted to say thank you very, very much for your leadership in this. And with that, reminder that there is a link in the chat box if you want to download the new version. This is just as a pre-publication version. We'll have the full formatted version out in about a week's time. And now it gives me great pleasure to pass the microphone over to Paquita, who will talk about the 10-year review and the future of conservation trust funds. So Paquita, thank you.
Thank you so much. The 10-year review and the practice standards were organized by Conservation Finance Alliance and the donors to be done in conjointly. And it has been a huge pleasure for me to work with Wolf's Company on managing that transition. I'm going to introduce right now Amilcar Guzman, who's one of the co-authors of both the practice standards and the 10-year review. And Amilcar is a partner with the Wolf's Company and has been really critically involved as a Chilean national living in Holland with managing research projects for them, particularly on environmental economics, financial strategies, and obviously nature conservation. So it's been wonderful to have somebody with much more kind of statistical thinking. And I'll be asking Amilcar to walk us through the methodology in a minute. So Amilcar, if you can throw up the first slide. Great. Okay, here we go. So this is the second book. We're hoping that the launch will happen November 11th. We will be doing a full-scale, webinar presentation, but we're going to give you a little bit of a teaser today. This particular book builds obviously on the previous 10-year review done by Barry Spergel and Philip Taib. But the idea was that was a full 12 years ago. And so what has happened with the Conservation Trust Fund community in this last decade? And Wolf's Company, particularly Amilcar, Viviana is not speaking with us today, but has been a huge, impressive author on much of this book. And all of you know Katie Matthias, who through her work, particularly on the Conservation Trust Fund Investment Survey, CTIS, has added a lot to this particular book, looking at the full decade in asset management, not just year by year, but what have we learned looking at these trends across the full decade. I also, before we move into sharing some of the details with you, just want to recognize that Wolf's Company, who managed this contract and helped us move the whole book along, were particularly just came together as a team, and I particularly want to thank Esther Wolf, Chris Dunmeijer, and Elizabeth Hartman, who were a big part of making this publication happen. So this is the title, Conservation Trust Funds 2020, Global Vision, Local Action, to really emphasize how important trust funds have been in moving planetary priorities down to where we can make a difference at the local level. So next slide. Turning it over to Amilcar to talk about what we've used in the methodology.
Thanks, Paquita. So following Paquita's introduction, first I would like to thank Red Lacan Cafe for this opportunity to share this preview. So we're very excited because this is the first opportunity when we will share actual results with the broader community. So we have been working together with the Conservation Finance Alliance and a very wonderful task force. I think it was described as the dream task force before already. And I really agree on that. So we have been working for around a year now, and it's been an incredible process. So just to tell you a little bit more about the methodology, we used a number of different approaches and methods to compile and collect data. And we focused on some general aspects which were the main, the core of this report. So there are three main aspects that we looked at. One is the evolution of CTFs over the last 10 years. Then is the role of CTFs in the current context. And then the possible evolution and opportunities for CTFs over the coming decade. So we kicked off this study actually in the pre-COVID-19 world. So we could see each other in person. We kicked off at the Cafe Assembly in Benin last year. I had the pleasure to participate in the assembly and meet many of the Cafe members. And we held workshops and consultations there, as well as Viviana, Luján, and Paquita Vaz attended and participated and facilitated workshops and consultations at the REDLAC Congress in Mexico. Since then, we conducted more than 65 interviews with different CTF representatives, partners, donor organizations, international NGOs that work closely with CTFs, and conservation finance experts. In parallel, we held regular monthly meetings and discussions with the task force, which had, as you have seen at the beginning of this whole session, it had more than 20 representatives of key donor and partner organizations, the CTF networks, and the Conservation Finance Alliance, among others. All these discussions and interviews helped us identify some of the most important issues for the CTFs, the most crucial developments among CTFs, and some relevant case studies, which I will describe in a few seconds. Then one of the most special aspects of the methodology is that we also implemented a global survey among CTFs, and we did this to be able to collect original and quantitative data. So we circulated this survey in English, Spanish, and French among 108 CTFs that were identified as active CTFs or operational CTFs worldwide. And the survey covered specific topics such as administration, asset management, resource mobilization, monitoring, reporting, and evaluation, and programmatic areas, among others. We also looked at some specific topics like challenges, conditions for success, the use of the practice standards, etc. Thanks to the support of the task force and other partners, we obtained responses from 50 CTFs, which is quite impressive because it represents more or less the 50% of the operational CTFs worldwide. And we also had a good representation in geographic terms. So we had representation from African CTFs, CTFs from Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia Pacific, North America, and Europe. Also in terms of CTF size, if we look at total assets and a number of other features. So it's quite a representative sample. Then the information collected through the survey was the main source of quantitative data to study evolution trends across these key areas. But we also complemented that with a couple of other activities or tasks. One, which was very important for the monitoring and reporting section, is that we work with a master's student, so Elizabeth Hartman, who was listed in the first slide, on a systematic review of annual and evaluation reports of CTFs. So she scanned information published online by all operational CTFs identified in the study and managed to download and analyze systematically more than 300 studies, annual reports, sorry, and evaluation reports. These reports, so we identified 53 CTFs who published annual and reevaluation reports over the last 10 years, and those were analyzed to obtain insight into conservation results reported in particular. Then additionally, and this is something that Katie Matthias has been working on already for years, we use results from the Conservation Trust Investment Survey. So the report includes a multi-year study, which covers 13 years of data. And we also present results on investment management and asset management based on that. So the data collection process, in addition to this, was supported with the update of the list of CTFs worldwide, which resulted in a database of CTF profiles, which was very useful to provide insight into general trends in the creation of CTFs. So Paquita will discuss some of them, so I will hand it over to her.
So Amilcar and I'll be going back and forth, but I hope we're whetting your appetites on how much data goes into this study and what we've learned. So when Barry and Philippe did the study in 2008, there were 68 CTFs. Since that time, 40 new CTFs have been founded, as you can tell, mainly in the Global South, and there are now 108 CTFs worldwide. That means this is really a growing sector. The incredible advances that a number of conservation trust funds have made, the fact that some of them are now 30 years old, many of you are turning 25, 26 years old. This is an institutionalized group of organizations now that have made a big difference in their nations, and it's getting others interested. So that's been a part of what's been driving this growth. Groups like Conservation Biodiversity Fund, Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, island groups in the Pacific, a lot of new African funds being founded. This is just a really exciting time where a lot of new CTFs are coming aboard. I think the practice standards, and again, we've integrated some of the learning from the practice standards with this 10-year review, have also really helped to increase the reputation and transparency of these organizations to make them much more viable and much more of a desired contribution to the economic development and conservation in these different countries. So we're seeing a lot of that. The other major trend of these 108, and we've got quite a lot of information about this, is just how much more complex they've become, managing much more complex financial flows, mainstreaming biodiversity concerns, and some of the next slides will get into that. So back to you, Amilcar. Oh, this one's me. So programmatic evolution. You know, again, 10, 12 years ago, we were all talking protected areas still, very fundamentally, with most of us working strictly on terrestrial protected areas. Today, over 45% of conservation trust funds have very strong marine and coastal programs. It's been a really big transition, as all of us have recognized that the overexploitation of marine areas, which I don't think we were fully aware of into the 2000s, has really taken a front seat. A number of new marine groups on the regional level, everything from a Global Blue Action Fund to Pacifico Med Fund, really focused on marine coastal systems, as well as new CTFs that are marine focused. Another area of real growth has been almost, 64% of conservation trust funds now talk about building local capacity as one of their key missions, understanding that the role of conservation trust funds in moving funding from a global perspective down to local, meeting local needs, stopping local deforestation, becoming more sustainable fisheries, et cetera, requires local capacity, and conservation trust funds have had to step into that vacuum, and they're all spending a lot more time and energy on that now. Similarly, I think we could say that, conservation trust funds in the past, many of them were strictly grant-making organizations, didn't do as much on the policy front, and now we have over 50% of them acknowledging right up front that they are doing a lot to help mainstream biodiversity into national policies, and really addressing some of the real difficulties that we have in terms of the funding for nature, the funding for protected areas, the funding for sustainability, never being enough when so many subsidies and policies support overexploitation. And conservation trust funds recognize that we have to be much more directly engaged in that conversation. And again, something we all know, but we now have the statistical numbers to show, is conservation trust funds have moved from, what you would call very strictly nature-based protected area management type of programs into a huge investment in livelihood, economic, and incentives linked usually to the Sustainable Development Goals, but also linked to climate change action and adaptability to help local communities going forward. So major programmatic evolution over the last decade. Amilcar?
Okay. Should I go with this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, so we also looked into the funding sources, and we see that, multilateral organizations like the Global Environmental Facility, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund have become increasingly very engaged with CTFs and providing big amounts of funding. National governments have also been a major contributors, especially during the startup phase. Bilateral organizations bilateral cooperation has been quite important. So the TFCA program, the German and French governments have been incredibly important to establish and set up new CTFs as well. International NGOs have been quite, over the last 10 years, were also very relevant, for example, to channel funds through specific programs or funds like, for example, the Global Conservation Fund of Conservation International. And then we have, of course, private foundations. One specific development that we have seen over the past years, and well, it started before, was the project Finance for Permanence. And we included here because the project Finance for Permanence has been instrumental to bring these different sources together and to coordinate efforts and articulate specific deals with a single closing to be able to establish a CTF with a long-term perspective. So this is something that we have also seen in a number of CTFs, and there are a couple of new deals. We also have a case study, as I will describe in a few minutes. And well, in the report, we also look into a few other themes. These are some of the additional areas that we will be sharing in November 11th, based on the survey results. So we will look into the governance models. There is a trend in diversification in governing bodies among CTFs in terms of the team, the board members, private sector representation, indigenous community representatives, etc. Then we will also share more about, and you can check in the report as soon as it's publicly available, on financial resilience. So the report also provides insight into the distribution of CTFs based on their assets and how they build financial resilience. We look at the different strategies they use for this. Then also in relation to that, we will share, so the report shares on the finance mechanisms for resource mobilization. We will show also a preview when we discuss the future of CTFs. And we look at CTFs in their startup phases, which are often established with support from one or two sources of funds and with perhaps one finance mechanism, in comparison with operational institutional CTFs, which tend to be much more diversified. They receive funding from more sources and use up to 5 different mechanisms in some cases. So operational institutional CTFs have been able to introduce some innovations, and we discussed that in the report as well. Then in terms of fund deployment, the review of annual reports also allowed us to estimate at least the amount of funding that has been disbursed by CTF and has been reported in their annual reports or evaluation reports. And that was estimated at around 2 billion over the last 10 years, or well, in a 10-year period between 2009 and 2018. The report explores the programs the CTF supported and what were some of the conservation results. So we look at different indicators they used, and we managed to aggregate some results for the CTFs that reported on common indicators. In terms of asset management, of course, we have results from the global survey of CTFs that we implemented specifically for this study, and from the Conservation Trust Investment Survey, the multi-year study. And we explore aspects such as investment performance and trends in asset management. We've also identified some opportunities for improvement. And here I will just give a quick preview of 3 main areas. And this is just to show you an example of the data that we have for one of those, which is monitoring of results or impact. So this has proven to be a persistent challenge for CTFs, and the review of the annual reports showed and confirmed something that most likely the conservation community and conservation trust fund community is aware of, is that there is a need for clear metrics and frameworks to measure program results, especially at the outcome and impact levels. There are only a few CTFs that use or provide baseline data. There are a few CTFs to date that provide sound data on their contributions towards national or international targets, for example, even though those are recognized as aspects that are very relevant for donors and CTFs as well. At the national or international level, so the contributions of CTFs have mainly been explored in qualitative terms. So there is lack of measurement there, or at least standard measures. And we identified that in the report. There are 2 other areas that we identified as key areas or opportunities for improvement. One is the formulas to calculate overhead costs. So some CTFs have adopted specific policies to calculate and set the target for the percentage of budget that is used to run their operations. But there is no single formula to estimate these costs. And that's, of course, creating some substantial discussions and unclarity. So when it comes to having discussions with donors and presenting information in a transparent manner. Overhead percentages vary across CTFs and program accounts, depending on, for example, on particular donors, type of projects or services being provided. And that's something that the report shows and is a big area of possible improvement as well. Finally, from the CTIS results, we see that CTF endowments have underperformed over the last years in both absolute and relative benchmarks. That's something that I believe that is not a mystery. It has been mentioned in some previous sessions as well. There are a few exceptions. So there are some top performers as well. But in general, the average has been underperforming. There have been some substantial efforts to improve the situation already. For example, particularly by smaller CTFs with less than 25 million asset base, for example, who are engaging in investment pooling to reduce investment costs and have access to higher performing fund managers. Investment pooling and shared service models as well on other areas are an attractive opportunity for smaller CTFs in particular. Some larger CTFs are increasingly making investments that consider ESG, so environmental, social, and corporate governance criteria. And they are actually performing as well or better than traditional investments. So that's also something that came out of the analysis that Katie conducted based on the CTIS survey. Then we also have 5 case studies which showcase some interesting cases that we identified as relevant for the Conservation Trust Fund community to learn from. The first case describes the transition from Fondo Ambiental Nacional in Ecuador to the FIAS and all the changes in the governing body and how and the evolution over time. The second one describes private sector engagement strategies, which is quite a key aspect as we will mention in the future of CTFs. They have in Fondo Acción, the case study presents some community-based enterprises, so efforts that Fondo Acción has put into work and engagement with the private sector and community-based enterprises, biodiversity compensations or carbon compensations, and an impact investment. So Fondo Acción is an early adopter of these type of approaches, and that's described. These approaches are described there in the case study in a very profound manner. Then the third one is the Coast Fund, which as a case study describes the creation, the achievement, and the challenges of these very special and unique funds created under a project finance for permanence deal. And it touches upon the unique structure, the unique governance structure that puts the First Nations at the heart of governance, investment management, and funding allocation. Then the fourth case study describes the launching of Biofund and how they, as a relatively young CTF, have investment heavily in consolidation and effective working relationship with government and enabling conditions. So in creating an enabling environment for conservation. And finally, we have a case study on the Micronesia Conservation Trust that describes the role that this regional CTF has played in capacity building for conservation. They have collaborated with a number of learning networks and capacity building networks and initiatives and have not only mobilized resources for capacity building activities, but have also collaborated directly and have managed capacity building programs as part of their overarching strategies. So that's also presented in this case study. So I will hand it over to Paquita again for some of the conclusions.
Well, as I'm sure you've just picked up from Amilcar, this is a thick book with a lot of learning in it, a lot of findings, thanks to all of your contributions and so many interviews and surveys, et cetera. We will be sharing a lot more of these specific results and the numerical results that Amilcar mentioned at the launch on November 11th, but we're excited, and we're about to share some more with you when we look at trends for the future. But just to wrap up this section on, kind of the teaser for Conservation Trust Funds 2020, the growing sector is huge, and we've got a lot of information on the types of CTFs that are being formed now. Those are currently, in addition, 5 additional CTFs are currently underway. So we see this as a really important growing sector because it's been so useful in so many countries that other countries are now really trying to get on board. The practice standards, the work that Barry Spergel and Kathy Mickelton put into the 2014 practice standards was clearly a needed contribution and has been widely used to build the reputation of the sector, of transparency, of strong administrative, greater efficiencies. I think this has been a really important contribution, and I'm very excited that the 2020 practice standards will hopefully continue to help all of these new CTFs and currently established CTFs move forward. The changes in programmatic evolution have been profound, and we're seeing more and more CTFs getting involved in nationally determined contributions in alignment with the Paris Accords. Obviously, we've already discussed quickly accreditation in the previous panel, ever-increasing integration with the Sustainable Development Goals. I think as the planet struggles with so many of these really major new changes that are affecting us all, and we recognize how integrated they are. And CTFs have been part of understanding that that integration needs to happen and coming to the table with the national governments and having a voice in how to pull these national commitments together. Been very exciting. As you know, there's been such a long-term debate about whether CTF should have endowments or whether the biodiversity crisis, the climate change crisis, et cetera, are so huge that we just need to pour all of the money into short-term, more project-oriented types of programs. And what we consistently found was that the CTFs that have been established with strong initial endowments that have enabled them to have regular support for their operating costs, that have enabled them to sit down with their government partners and say, hey, we have a seat at this table because we bring resources to bear, we bring innovations to bear, we bring this integrated thinking and solution-oriented approach to bear, has been really, really important. And those groups with endowments have been more than able to leverage that money to bring in even more sinking fund money, project fund money, with the accreditation, bringing more money into those countries to make conservation and SDG work move forward. So that has been actually over the long term an incredible contribution to the institutional resilience and stability and effectiveness of these organizations. And finally, one of the big conclusions and the reason for the title of the book this year is this niche of linking global priorities with effective local investments is a niche that cannot be overstated. It's the future going forward as we look at these planetary-wide problems that become so obvious, and especially this past year, and how to make investments happen locally, that the CTFs that really have the strong local understanding of local institutional capacity, government agency capacity, that are able to transfer between different governments as governments come and go, and make these long-term investments have really made the difference. So those are a few of our conclusions. What we'd like to do now is kind of walk from, that's what we're looking at in the past. How does this look going forward? And we were asked to put together this presentation on the future of conservation trust funds 2020 to 2030. Obviously a very challenging moment for us in trying to think about it, but we want to share some of the the numeric issues on the trends first, and then obviously kind of what's the big thinking after COVID-19 and all of the changes that are affecting us. So as we've already discussed, there's been huge programmatic evolution. One of the really nice things that Amilcar and Wolf's company, working with the task force, did was put in questions about, what are you doing that's different looking forward? So this is how conservation trust funds responded to the question of, what are the things that you'll be incorporating in your thinking about new programs going forward? And aside from the usual, protecting protected areas, these are major contributions that all of the CTFs want to see in their future programs. Well-being of local communities, making sure we really combine and work with our national governments on everything from national biodiversity strategies, HE targets, nationally determined contributions, SDGs. So we see this incredible interconnectivity between how the CTFs can work closely with governments on these now planetary priorities going forward is definitely statistically shown in the survey results and things that we've received. So very exciting news there.
So the CTF survey also explored the finance mechanisms that CTFs have used, so that are currently in use and have been used over the last 10 years. And some of the finance mechanisms that CTFs would like to use or are considering using to mobilize resources or generate additional funds over the next decade. And so this chart presents a comparison. Of course, it's very long, and you can have a look at it with more detailed once you have the report. But we just wanted to highlight a couple of key results here. So something that we see, and you can see it in this part of the screen, so close to the middle, is that donations to endowment funds and sinking funds will most likely, or at least are expected to remain the most important funding mechanism for CTFs over the next decade, or at least CTFs see it that way. However, most CTFs also expect to rapidly diversify funding through other conservation finance mechanisms. And some of the key takeaway messages from this was that there are 3 areas of diversification that will be very important for diversification to generate funding. And those are, well, a continuing trend of implementation of carbon and biodiversity compensations or participation or involvement in these type of schemes. Partnerships with private sector, which are expected to be instrumental for many for the implementation of many of these other mechanisms that CTFs expect to implement. And the third one is that many CTFs are looking into impact investment and blended finance transactions. So with regards to the last one, interviews, so CTFs can play a role in facilitating fund administration, which can generate funds for CTF operational or programmatic areas, budgets. But also interviewees foresee that the most prominent future role of CTFs is in their potential to deploy de-risking instruments to attract further capital from investors. So as part of the whole arrangement to and facilitating and enabling the actual transactions. So CTFs have capacity for that and can participate in these mechanisms to help and mobilize more resources into conservation. We also looked into the diversification of programmatic instruments. So here we look at the instruments that CTFs use and are expecting to use to deploy funds for conservation. So the results show again that CTFs expect to remain at their core. So they are not expecting to deviate from their mission, which is implementing grant-making programs. So there is no doubt that CTFs will continue to focus on grant making, but, and you can see all the grant making here at the center of your screen again. But grant making programs are expected to expand and evolve. So one of the most evident examples is what you see here in project specific grants And you can see that most CTFs or a number of CTFs that used to implement project-specific or used to issue or make project-specific grants are not expecting to implement them anymore, but many more CTFs would like to move to larger grants and over longer time periods. So that's one major change that was perhaps predicted or foreseen at the time of this survey. And then, while traditional grants can enhance the enabling conditions, CTFs also expect to scale and increase their impact by using other mechanisms. There's some mechanisms that have been rarely used by CTFs to date, but are being increasingly considered in this path. And this includes, for example, the return-based investments, such as microfinance or equity investments, and the use of some risk management instruments. These can include providing loans to leverage other funds or loan guarantees or de-risking capital, for example. As another important instrument, we can find payments for ecosystem services, in which the interviewees and CTFs foresee a major role in management and investment of the funds generated through payments for ecosystem service schemes, the sign-ups of those schemes, and perhaps the most important one as well is promoting and informing required changes in legal frameworks when required, of course. So those are the main areas. And then in general, another aspect that was also highlighted in the analysis of this aspect, so the fund deployment, is how innovation and engagement with the private sector will be critical for CTFs. And as I mentioned before, one good example is provided in the case study of Fondo Acción. And there are other front runners, there are other early adopters, such as the Mexican Fund for Nature Conservation. And there are examples from different regions, of course. And something important to note is that most of these trends were, of course, investigated when the survey was conducted, which was in a pre-COVID-19 world. And although many of them will for sure remain, will continue to remain valid, we've also seen the need to analyze them or look at them with new lenses. So we have analyzed and we have looked at these trends with a new perspective that COVID-19 has given. And I will hand it over to Paquita to present some of the findings and the information that we have compiled on that.
And then came COVID-19. I mean, what can I say? You know, what Amilcar is presenting is exactly with the trends that we were seeing in January. And all of you have been meeting and convening and talking and figuring out the best ways you can possibly continue to support the local capacity you've built, the grantees you've had. And COVID-19 has thrown a wrench into all of those traditional plans. It's also created a truly unprecedented opportunity to transform human interaction with nature. By laying bare our vulnerability to zoonotic diseases due to overexploitation of resources, collapse of ecosystem functions, we expect continued climate-driven changes, you know, all of this negativity that we're all talking about. But within that, conservation trust funds have a huge amount to offer at the moment. And many of you are incredibly well positioned to even better so than special purpose vehicles that could be created to help us move forward with that. So what are some of the really big issues that you can all expect and many of you already are working on? Almost all of our governments are falling into big debt problems. Huge amount of time and energy will be needed for debt solutions. Obviously, thanks to the TFCA, Tropical Fund for, I'm suddenly having one of those moments. The TFCA funds in the past and working on debt swaps have been really important contributors to the experience that we've had as conservation trust funds looking forward. And there's a lot coming up thanks to NatureVest with the Nature Conservancy and other groups that are really looking at future debt solutions that so many of these countries are facing. Another thing is that most governments in the past, when faced with real serious problems of large-scale unemployment, economic decline, have invested heavily in infrastructure. We're already seeing a number of governments stating that that's what they're going to be doing. They're looking into how to kind of restart the economy with bootstrapping infrastructure investments. This is a huge opportunity to mainstream biodiversity concerns and climate concerns from the beginning so that those infrastructure investments go into a more sustainable future. I know many of you are already very engaged in those conversations, and this is the opportunity moment. This is also a moment of reflection that I think I'm seeing in some of the countries where I've been spending the most time and attention, where people are spending more time and are more ready to see policy change moments. You know, the kind of implicit assumptions behind our past development model, where economic subsidies for overexploitation were so common, are definitely no longer as accepted. The idea that people can just destroy topsoil or destroy different types of ecosystems without understanding the impact that will have for future generations, our water supplies, et cetera. There's more and more people in government and political areas at local and regional and even in some areas national levels that are really seeing this, and I think seem to be more open. And some of you have talked to me about that, that you're seeing these open opportunities with groups that previously hadn't really been interested in working as much with conservation style organizations. We've talked at length about the evolutionary part of your programs and the integration of ecosystem conservation and human well-being in your conversations at this level. So this alignment with national future direction is just such an opening for conservation trust funds, and your ability to help manage some of these planetary financial flows as well as local national infrastructure investments is clearly going to be driving a lot of your work going forward. So this is one of the major changes. Some of the competencies that we see the conservation trust funds who've been talking about this having and needing, more and more of you are convening needed alliances. You're facilitating these meetings between debtor governments and lending governments. You're facilitating meetings between the private sector and different government agencies to come together, private sector and private sector, et cetera. More and more of you are helping to look at what these types of compensation programs and offset programs will be. Again, a really strong needed alliance between government, private sector, and the conservation trust funds for managing those monies successfully. So that's one of the key needs going forward. Building green and blue economies. This is obviously, it's been a huge part of the conversation for the last 3 days, and I believe the next panel will also be addressing this. Compensation offset mechanisms we just talked about, mitigation funds. Many of you are talking about seeing increases in this. One of the things that Wolf's Company and I have worked really hard on in this publication is sharing your stories, both the case studies that Amilcar mentioned, as well as just small, quick little, FIES in El Salvador is doing a lot on compensation funding, and here's some examples of how they're doing that. These kinds of small examples pop up throughout the book so that you can see and think about how to apply them to your realities in your conservation trust funds. When we talked about what have been the major resource mobilization strategies in the last session, we talked about the traditional donors, and as you've no doubt mentioned, we didn't talk about payment for ecosystem services and offsets and compensation, because for most of you, it's not currently a big part of your economic, your current financial funding sources. But what we are seeing is more and more of you engaging in how to look at landscape, seascape, transformational opportunities on especially agro and food production economies. All of us know that there's much more work happening in water funds. We're all seeing a lot more work in roundtables and certification programs. Some of you are doing some really innovative new work on insurance schemes for nature-based infrastructure. So we are seeing this as a really important growing area. I think all of you in your survey responses on what you see as the future economically for your conservation trust funds understand that these will be a big part of your ability to help work on transforming us towards a more sustainable production model. And finally, go back one. Finally, we talked briefly before about the fact that 65% of you now have a strong program and are actively stating you are investing in local capacity building. And for the most part, that is small scale nonprofits, groups that are grantees. But what conservation trust funds are increasingly being asked to do is to step up to also work with small scale businesses, small and medium sized enterprises, possibly even microfinance, helping to incubate some of these new sustainable development ideas, providing equity investments, looking at loan guarantees. So this is another big new area where conservation trust funds are very well positioned to be able to step up in support of green and blue economies going forward. So those are some of the kind of major future pieces that we're seeing. Some of you are already deeply engaged, others are just getting started, but I do see this, and I think the CFA task force working with us, really saw these as important issues. What we're seeing going forward is conservation trust funds are becoming essential institutions. Many of you already are essential institutions in your national milieu. You have a seat at the table. You're bringing high levels of ambition. When your governing body and your executive director have those connections that are really needed for the leadership that you're providing, it's an amazing ability to leverage resources at the global scale, at the national scale, and increasingly with private sector to make these changes happen. We've talked repeatedly about linking global resources with local capacity. That is the particular niche that we're really pushing here. And we have lots of examples of how that's working. And obviously having Constance and other donors here at the table showcases the importance of them trying to reach out through conservation trust funds to have the impact that we all want to see at the local level. You'll be accelerating these financial mechanisms for the transformative work we need on both land and sea scale levels. I know this sounds basic, but conservation trust funds understand money, and you can project the financing needed. Most of the other major nonprofit organizations just don't get that at the national level. And I think having that ability to talk about money, talk about investments, talk about the need to really finance at the level necessary. Project finance for permanence has been a really important part of making that happen in a number of these cases. And so these are all experiences that we bring to the table in this. And finally, we know that we're not reaching the HE goals right now. We know that we're behind on the SDG goals. We know that the Paris Accords are in disarray thanks to a number of different governments backing off, et cetera. But, we're still seeing this huge gap between biodiversity funding and what's really needed to make that happen. And we're already talking about new ambitious goals like the Pledge for Nature, 30% by 2030. These are such great opportunities. They're so inspiring. They bring us together. And at the same time, we need to have that really strong financing background to talk about how that biodiversity funding gap can be filled, in large part just by changing the way policies and current subsidies are working, in large part by working with our multilateral agencies, bilateral agencies, the major funding sources that have traditionally helped to get conservation trust funds to where they are today. And we will be needing to scale up to fill that gap and to help mainstream these policies so that the appropriate funding is provided and we do have a chance for a much more sustainable future. So on behalf of Wolf's Company and Aligning Visions, I just wanted to once again thank the donors. Next slide, Amilcar. For making these two studies happen. They've been a huge amount of work and investment on part of the task force, the Conservation Finance Alliance, and the authors. But at the same time, we've all learned so much from this process and grateful for it. And the final slide is just another big clap for the Task Force and Conservation Alliance working with REDLAC and CAFE that have really helped pull this together. So Katie Mathias has joined us as our moderator for this section so that we can handle questions, because obviously we've been talking, so we haven't been able to follow the chat or follow the questions that have popped up. So I'm going to ask Katie to get on and moderate our Q&A.
Thanks, Paquita and Amilcar. Thank you so much for sharing those findings. I am actually looking at the time and realizing that we are up against the 2-hour mark. And I think we could probably continue to discuss these topics for another 2 hours. What I am going to, instead of going into the Q&A right now, what I'm going to invite everyone to do is be aware that we will launch this, the full report of the 10-year review. I'm going to correct a date. It's actually on November 12th. So please watch your Conservation Finance Alliance mail. If you're not signed up for the CFA newsletter, you can do that on our website. And then you'll get announcements of the release of the full practice standards document, the release of the 10-year review document that Paquita and Amilcar have been previewing, and as well as webinars that we're working on organizing for. Sorry, I'm going to stop my video because that's distracting me. As well as a series of webinars that we're working on doing in more detail to talk about specific areas of the new standards that have been developed. So again, please watch your CFA email. Look for the full practice standards document in about a week to 10 days. Look for the launch of the 10-year review on November 12th. And we hope that you'll continue to share your experiences with the standards with us. And participate in the series of webinars that we're planning to put together. Let me just take one last moment to thank our panelists and speakers today, Constance and Lorenzo. Joining us for the launch of the standards themselves were Zdenka from REDLAC and Karen Price from CAFE, as well as Esther and Viviana from Wolf's Company, Paquita and Amilcar for your presentation, and to Serge and Karen McDonald-Gale for your participation in the panelists, as well as to David, of course, for moderating the panel and for launching the standards. So thank you to everybody, and I will turn it back over to REDLAC to wind us up.
Thank you very much, everyone, for this really engaging session. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, David. Thank you to the Conservation Finance Alliance, to everyone who has contributed to making this a reality. I have listened so carefully to everything that was said and took so many notes, and there is so much to learn for our specific organization, for our networks. So this has been a huge effort, and thank you all for your work. And we look forward to the official launch of the CFA 10-year review. I would like to invite all of you to join us to our next session, which will start in half an hour. And this session is about building resilience and promoting the blue and green economy, which is, as you heard from Paquita, one of these big areas into which conservation trust funds are now moving. And so this is going to be a very engaging session. We have a great group of panelists who will be participating. This will be moderated by Maria Jose Gonzalez from the MAR Fund, who of course has a lot of experience also in making this. So I hope you can all join us in half an hour. This will be our last session. We will then have conclusions, and this will be the end of our first virtual Congress. And I couldn't be happier with the way this is ending, with so much information to share from all of you. Thank you, Paquita, Amilcar, Viviana, everyone who made this a reality. We'll see you again in half an hour.